Welcome to Chapter 13. Okay, so let's talk about some strategies. So effective classroom instruction, and when we talk about inclusive classrooms, what do we expect? So effective instruction for all students is a major purpose of inclusion. So obviously it's not just to be in the classroom, but you have to be receiving effective instruction. Classrooms are being reorganized to meet the RTI models, and even if you're not officially using RTI, some of those principles are really solid and a way of framing your thinking about what level of support do certain students need. Basic reading skills are the blocks for later learning. So you've got reading, writing, and math. One of my professional views, and you can consider this, is that elementary school, the key thing that students need to get out of elementary school are reading, writing, and math, and that those basic skills are more important than any specific content. For example, yes, you do learn about the three branches of government in the third grade. That is important. But you'll also talk about the three branches in government in the 8th grade and the 11th grade. And so that content is not as important as learning how to read in the 3rd grade. So those are really important building blocks that students need to be able to have so that they can continue to progress in their learning. So principles and practice to support effective instruction. Teacher behaviors in delivering effective instruction. Instruction is well organized. And I think the key here when we talk about organization, and what I really think about, and this is the hard part, is to have well organized instruction means well planned instruction. And so when we talk about including students with all sorts of different needs, we are adding significantly to the planning load of the teacher. And so that's something to consider, something to get help with, something to build in. So in effective instruction, the student's attention is focused. You may have seen the planning that has what the teacher is doing and what the students are doing, and how for every block of time you're kind of putting out like what's the teacher doing, what are the students doing, because you want that fast-paced moving. Students don't have time to wander off. Their brains don't have time to wander off. What they're supposed to do is clear to them. They know what they need to do. They don't have extra time, so they know they need to get it done now. And their attention is really focused on the tasks. Multiple opportunities to learn are provided with feedback. That feedback, of course, is crucial. Follow-up monitoring is practice. If expectations are clear, and this means clear to the student. It's amazing how as adults there are so many things that we know what the expectations are, and we forget that our students coming from different backgrounds might not know what the expectations are, might not know what to do in a certain situation. Of course, we know when you get a piece of paper, you write your name at the top. Those type of things, if nobody's ever taught you that before, you don't know that. And so some of our students, sometimes we'll have students that move in from homeschool situations that have never had more structured education, and they'll get there in the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. They'll come into our schools, and one of the things that we see is that they haven't internalized these school behaviors yet that other students who have been in school in a more structured environment since kindergarten have. And it just reminds us that some of these expectations are not that clear unless we have stated them, unless we have practiced them with our students and those types of things. And then direct instruction is provided for struggling learners. So at some point in time when our learners are struggling, we sit down, we come up with a systematic plan, and we teach them exactly what it is that they need to know to build those skills. So grouping students. Whole group instruction sometimes is less flexible, and so we might group students in several different ways. Of course, grouping also adds to things like collaboration, Let students get to know each other better. So there's other benefits to groups as well. But there's a couple different types of grouping strategies. So we can do our grouping strategies where we skill group and we have students of similar skill together. We can do mixed skill groups or cooperative groups. We might do some individual tutoring or peer tutoring, where the teacher is giving really focused one-on-one instruction, or somebody else is giving some really focused one-on-one or one-on-two, super small group instruction. So cautions when using skill or ability grouping. I always am very careful to talk about skill. Most often we're doing skill grouping. We are not necessarily grouping students by what their potential ability is, but by what skills they have currently. So when students are in a low skill group for much of the day, they often don't benefit academically. Because they're pure models, they don't have to push themselves. If I'm the highest one in my little group of 3, and I don't realize that we're the 3 lowest in the school, I'm starting to think, oh, I got this. Like, I don't need to push myself. Fewer students assume leadership roles. More students engage in disruptive behavior. They often are students that have some of the same behavioral complexities, and sometimes putting them together in groups, they learn more disruptive behaviors from each other. Assignment to lower group tends to be long-term, and that's one of the issue. Contact between students across levels is limited, and quality of instruction tends to be poor. Oftentimes, our learners with the most significant needs end up being instructed by those that potentially could have the least skills. Some of the things I'm thinking about in terms of this is we'll take our students that have very significant needs, and then we put them in a group, and they're being taught by an instructional assistant who we haven't given enough professional development to, is not getting quite as much guidance. And so it's one of those things where, as if they were with somebody who was a reading specialist, or somebody who has had more background and training, that might be advantageous for them. So grouping, mixed skill ability, and cooperative learning, there are small groups of 3 to 6. They work on content. Students work together, and the roles are pretty, typically defined, where, one student is supposed to be doing this, one student's going to be doing this. If you don't have those defined roles, what happens is that one person in the group can be doing all the work. And when that happens, of course, you want every single person in the group to be having to have that same, maybe not the same cognitive demand, but to be challenged and to be doing the work, the cognitive work. And so sometimes in groups, the tricky thing, if they're not well structured and well defined, what can happen is that some kids can kind of hide in groups, and then some students can end up being in groups that, where one student feels like they end up having to do significantly more work than you want one student to do. And that puts a lot of pressure on that student to carry the entire group. Now, there can be advantages. You can learn a lot. People can be leaders in different ways, and those types of things. But they need to be structured, and students need to be taught how to function well in groups. So again, going back to those clear expectations, if you all of a sudden go, okay, now you're a group, and you haven't talked about group process, and if you haven't taught them about what the roles look like and what the responsibilities look like and what it means to be a part of a group, then you're going to have probably less effective groups. Pause and reflect. Consider the ways you were grouped for instruction when you were in school. What were the most common grouping arrangements in elementary school, secondary school? Which grouping arrangements made it easier for you to learn content? Why? Cooperative learning groups are at times frustrating for students. Have you experienced this frustration? Why? How can frustrating experience for students when using cooperative learning be minimized? What are the instructional strengths of the different types of instructional groups? Weaknesses? What is the flexible use of groups so important? I think that should say, why is the flexible use of groups so important? So when we talk about some of these things, groups can be rather frustrating at times. One of my friends, on the front of his office, he's a professor, he has this little saying that says that he wants his former group members to be his pallbearers at his funeral so that they can let him down one more time. And so I'm sure people have been in those groups where they've had to do all the work and other people are not contributing, and that can be really frustrating. The other thing about, the importance of mixing it up, I know when I was in school, we often did, I was not often in skill groups in terms of, I did much more, they did much more grouping where they were trying to do the cooperative learning groups. And one time in high school, we got to be, in skill groups, and I got to be with the other, like top 5% of academic achievers in the high school. And to this day, I have a picture in my bedroom of us doing our project, because it was a phenomenal, remarkable experience that I had never had before. When you could get that level of motivation together in one group. We dressed up in period costumes for when we presented. We spent days. We just had so much fun. We had all these inside jokes about our high school built within our presentation, which really made it engaging. And anyway, it was one of those experiences that I still remember and treasure to this day, and that only ever happened to me in high school once, where I was able to be a part of those groups. Okay, tutoring. So many people think that tutoring is the optimal mode for struggling students. Intensive tutoring can be provided in like the Tier 3 RTI models. And there are some instructional strategies and why we do things when you talk about like choral reading and choral response. The reason that those have been created and that those small group practices use those is the idea is that they're trying to make small groups as much like one-on-one instruction as possible. And one of the huge benefits of one-on-one instruction is that as a student in one-on-one instruction, every single question that's asked, I have to do the cognitive demand to answer it. I have to do the cognitive work to answer it. And so that's why you see a lot of choral responses. That's one way that we try to take groups and make it more like individual work and make it so that every single person in that group has to respond to every single question and is doing the cognitive work and pushing themselves for every single question, which is one of the primary benefits of one-on-one tutoring. So peer tutoring can be beneficial to both parties. There are class-wide peer tutoring practices so that students are not being targeted. There are a few caveats to that, and we'll talk about the tutoring procedures here. So tutoring has to have limits on it. There have to be clearly specified times a day for the tutoring. I know there was a little first grader that was asked and boundaries were not put on to help out another first grade student. This little first grader was, very conscientious, but then felt completely responsible for this other student all day long. And it ended up being a problem. The parents were upset because, and not that the teachers meant to put that much pressure on this first grade student, but they didn't put the bounds. It was like, here, Jimmy, please help Jack. Model for him the good behavior, those types of things. Be his cheerleader. And then what happened is they didn't put the boundaries on that. And that little first grader thought it meant that every second of every day, going back to the clear expectations, as adults, we might know what we mean. But if it's not really laid out, a first grader might not know what we're expecting of them. Clearly describe specific assignments and provide related materials for tutors. So again, it needs to be designed by the teacher. What they're doing has to be driven and designed by the teacher. Tutors should work with tutorees long enough to complete a sequence of assignments, but it should be, targeted and really focused. Tutoring assignments should be changed every couple of weeks. There can be a lot of dependency that happens, and we want to utilize students being on their best behavior. Tutors should not administer tests or be responsible for other student evaluation. All students should be both tutors and tutorees. Developing a peer-wide tutoring program takes time, and like we said, in practice. And let parents know that peer tutoring will be used and that all students will be both tutors and tutorees. It's always best for a lot of this information to come from the teacher. As we know, a lot of times even older students are not the best reporters of what's going on and why. So effective instruction in reading, when we talk about the big five, the key areas of reading, we've got phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. Of course, those are always going to be some of those key components that you'll be working on. Explicit instruction. This is where we're really going to have those moments where we say, this letter makes this sound. There are times that you might be doing, more. There are times that people may use strategies where students have to make references, but really effective reading instruction doesn't make the student have to figure it out. Instead, there are times that students should construct knowledge, and really trying to figure out when that is. But for things that are basic skills and have a basic right answer, oftentimes being direct with students and giving them those skills can be really helpful. Small group instruction for struggling readers. A lot of times they need that targeted instruction. We talked about choral responses because that gets students answering and doing the demand. The peer interaction, the systematic instruction. This is where you're going to really hone in on what skill does this student need and make sure they get targeted instruction in those specific skills that they're really working on. So that those struggling readers, they need that targeted. Oftentimes we'll do double doses with them so that they're getting the same reading instruction as everybody else during the core reading instruction, as well as having times when they're getting additional reading instruction. How were you taught to read? If you learn to read with ease, how do the structured, intensive methods of reading instruction described here differ from how you were taught? Why are these methods needed for students who struggle? Reflect on your experience in a class in which you learned a lot. What were the characteristics of a class in which you learned very little? How did these classes differ? So effective instruction in writing, stages of writing, pre-writing, draft, revision, editing, publishing. You can see that there's lots of steps to go through. Helpful attitudes for teachers when dealing with struggling writers. Expect all students to write, no matter what it is. My 4-year-old will sometimes do scribbles, or maybe she gets the first letter. Even so, really young children, having them practice writing and making a list, even if it's not even complete words. Essential. And when you talk about differentiation, they need to be putting pen to paper, and we can figure out what that looks like, even if it's just they try to get the first letter and then it's scribbles. Identify the obstacles that they're facing. Different students face different obstacles, and once you can target that, you can help them overcome that. Early intervention. This also goes back to writing as early as possible and getting as much practice as possible. Balanced instruction. And access to technology. We have a lot of technology nowadays. We've got voice to speech. We have predictive software. There is a lot of technology that might be helpful for writers. And a lot of the pre-writing strategies are really, really key. And there's technology for those pre-writing strategies. We all know what it's like to look at a blank sheet of paper. And that's really difficult and can be daunting. Whereas if we've done the brainstorming and we know what we need to write, if somebody's giving us structure, another obstacle that students often face is that we ask them to be too creative too soon. What we really want to make sure that we're doing is that we're providing structure, like the 3-paragraph essay or the 5-paragraph essay, or how to write a paragraph. In the beginning, students need that structure. They might need sentence starters. There might be some of those things, but the more structure you can provide students at the beginning when they're practicing, and then once they have the skills, they can be creative. Effective instruction in mathematics. Ensure that all students have prior knowledge, and this goes back to really making sure you've got strong assessments. Mathematics is so sequential that it can be really difficult if students have gaps and we never go back and address those gaps. If I don't understand that we've got a base 10 system, then everything that comes beyond that is going to be difficult. If I don't understand that addition is a faster way of counting the number in a set, and that then multiplication is an even faster way of determining the number of a set than addition, then I'm missing the big picture, and hopefully somebody can go back and fill that in for me. Teacher modeling, sufficient time for practice with that key ingredient of feedback, supporting struggling students, instruction in small groups using systematic instruction, going back to that systematic instruction, going back to that what skills do these students need, and being really explicit in how this algorithm is performed, why it's performed, those types of things. Instruction should be planned, fast-paced, and varied to ensure student engagement. Those key elements should be, we're not just talking about effective math instruction, but reading instruction and all of those things as well. Be part of the fast pace of instruction is that students need repetition. Somewhere between 7 and 150 repetitions are what students need. And the more fast-paced, the more repetitions we can get in for students. Now, our students with slower processing speeds, you'll have to modulate that, but the pacing should be fast for that student. And so how fast that is will depend on the student and their processing speed. Use concrete and abstract examples. Typically, we move from the concrete to the abstract. We typically use manipulatives to make things more concrete before we move abstract. And we encourage think aloud strategies. The teacher thinks aloud, like, here's how I solved this. 8 plus 5. 8 is the bigger number. So I start with 8 and then I add on 5. So 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I don't have to start back and count up from 1 to 8. And as I think aloud and I do that, then students can also get that understanding. And when you have them start thinking aloud with their thinking, you can target those errors more specifically. Okay. So effective instruction, putting it all together. Effective instruction depends on collaboration. Effective instruction is well organized, which means well planned. Effective teachers have a toolbox of strategies, and that's what you'll really want to work on building. And effective teachers are lifelong learners. We all know that the first time that we teach something or do something, it's not going to be as good as the third or fourth time that we do it, because we're going to improve, we're going to reflect, and we're going to get better ourselves. So pause and reflect. Several researchers contend that individualized tutoring is the optimal instructional method for meeting the needs of students who are struggling academically. Do you agree? Why or why not? What are the advantages and disadvantages of individualized tutoring programs within classrooms and schools? Corrective reading is a research-based reading program for struggling readers. It is highly structured and scripted. Direct instruction approaches for teaching alphabetic fluency and comprehension. Do you believe that the use of highly structured and scripted reading programs removes the creativity from teaching of reading to the disadvantage of struggling readers? Why or why not? Many students with disabilities have difficulty keeping up with grade-level peers in math. Research suggests that using manipulatives to help students learn math concepts facilitates mastery of the concept and improves maintenance of the learned skill. Does the use of manipulatives promote dependency on these tools for solutions to math problems? Why or why not? When is it appropriate to transition children from reliance on manipulatives for calculation support? Okay, thank you.